I was born in England during King Henry VIII's reign. I wasn't anyone important. Wasn't ever going to be either. All I was a little chambermaid who was lucky enough to stay out of the way of the royal family's many dramas. I had waited on Queen Catherine of Aragon, and while she was a nice woman, I was not overly taken with her. She did her duties as queen, did her best to care for her subjects, and was even a great pious woman. But if it had not been for her tragedy of a marriage, she would not have been memorable. In the years that followed, I was chambermaid to all subsequent queens. Anne Boleyn was a very interesting woman, and I would say that she was my favorite. She was light and dark, mysterious yet open as a book, and I found her enchanting in a way I could not put into words at that time, though now I would say I had a crush. Watching her head be sliced from her body was a difficulty that I've been fortunate to not experience again. Jane Seymour was little more than a young girl when she ascended and died. Anne of Cleves was a wonderful, clever woman, and I did enjoy her while she was in the castle. I was happy when she was divorced instead of beheaded. By the time the last two Catherines, Parr and Howard, came around, I was no longer interested in learning about my sovereign, so I regretfully did not learn anything of them. My life was fairly privileged. Living in the castle meant I was more likely to be fed regularly, have shelter, be out of the elements during winter. Until my 8th year of life, I was with my mother, a beggar and a prostitute who did her best to care for me, but was unable to do so. Many times in her care did I go days without food, find myself on the receiving end of one of her customers when she was deemed inadequate to sate their needs, worried I would freeze solid in the cold and snow when we could not find even a bit of shelter. My early upbringing made me value my low place among the wealthy nobility as if I were uplifted to heaven itself. The work may have been hard. I may still have been sexually accosted on occasion when a nobleman took an interest, but no longer did I fear I would die. Well, I did not, at least, until Queen Mary took her place at the throne. During her rule, she went on a rampage against her Protestant subjects. I was one of the first outed as a Protestant, having been an open practitioner my entire life. Up until that point, I had never felt it was dangerous, but very, very quickly I understood that mistake. Younger women who I worked with, who were looking to curry favor for themselves, were quick to turn me over to those in power. I was quickly locked in the tower with my fellows as we awaited our trials and eventual execution. While I was one of the early to be captured, I was not among those first sent to their fiery deaths. Day by day, I and my cellmates were forced to listen to the agonized screams of other Protestants as they shrieked out their last in the courtyard below our window. Some days I would stand and watch, both unable and unwilling to take my eyes away. I felt that it was my duty to watch, pray for their souls, and be sorrowful on their behalves against the multitudes who came to joyfully watch them burn. Deep in my soul there is a hate harbored for that self-righteous bitch that 400 years has done nothing to dampen. While I waited in my damp, rat and flea-infested cell for my fate, I became friends with another woman, much older than myself, who was an utter terror of what was to come. Each time a burning began, she would curl herself into a ball, whimpering and sobbing so hard I feared she would choke. I did my best to comfort her, although at most times it was impossible to tell if she could even sense my presence. One day, many weeks into our imprisonment, she woke me with a hard grip on my arm that startled me from what little sleep I was able to get.
"Anna, I cannot be burnt again,"
she whispered urgently. Her pale blue eyes were wide, filled with tears, bloodshot from her grief. "Mary, what do you mean again?" I questioned, my foggy brain doing its best to understand. Her face was pale as a ghost, her lips quivering as a child's would.
"I have a secret, Anna. It's kept me alive for a very long time, gotten me through many, many attempts on my life, but I'm so afraid now. I've been burned to bones and ash before, twice, and I'm too afraid to endure it again. I wish to die and be done with this awful world, but I can't do so until I've rid myself of this ability."
I was confused. I was fatigued from starvation, dehydration, and illness from the fleas and horrid conditions. What she said made no sense to me. "What are you talking about, Mary?" I queried. Mary grasped my face in both her hands. Her face pleaded with me to believe her. A God gifted this to my own mother so long ago that Jesus himself had yet to bless us all with his sacrifice. An old God, deep in a grove, was so taken with her that it gifted her with the ability to live as long as he. But it comes at the price of taking those extra years from others. My mother gave me her power when my father died, and she could not go on without him. I was born in 1202, Anna. I have lived so long, but my mother lived so much longer. I cannot die unless I give this power to another person, lest it revive me. Please, take this burden from me and set me free, Anna. There was a fever ravaging my brain, and in my delirium, I simply nodded my head, unsure of what was truly going on. Her relief was instant. Mary threw her arms around me and sobbed her thanks into my shoulder. She praised me for my bravery and kindness to take her place. I had no idea what I had gotten myself into. Mary leaned back, wiped her eyes, and thanked me one last time before a thick white smoke erupted from her mouth, nose, and eyes. I went to scream, and the smoke dove into my open mouth and down my throat. I felt a cold wash through every molecule of my body. My veins felt as if there was liquid ice flowing through them. My skin went numb. A light fog seemed to waft off me in the cold air of my cell, and I wondered if this was God smiting me for accepting witchcraft into my body. Moments later, I became cognizant of the terrified shrieks of my other cellmates. I had lost all awareness in those strange moments while my possession occurred, forgotten that other people shared this dank little space with me, forgotten that this would look much worse than simple Protestant beliefs to anyone who saw what just happened. Guards burst into the cell to deduce the cause of so much commotion. They spotted the pile of dust that remained of my friend, heard all the accusations of witchcraft from my fellow inmates, and took no time at all to lever their judgment on me. I was instantly grabbed in their rough hands and hauled out of the tower to the burning grounds. I had not yet recovered from the shock to my system. My skin burned with cold, my whole being racked with shivers that I could not control. There was no strength in my body with which to even try to defend myself. I was stripped bare before the crowd of jeering peasants. Iron shackles bound me to a boulder scorched black and still scalding hot against my back from recent use. I could hear the guards declaring me a witch to the crowd. They explained how special a treat it was for them to be witnessing my execution. Bile sprayed from my mouth, stomach churning in terror as they piled wood around me. Foul, chunky fluid was poured over my legs, the smell causing me to vomit again. I realized quickly that it was liquefied, putrid pig fat, meant to make me burn all the better, but not in an efficient manner. My eyes met those of my executioner. He gave me a self-satisfied smirk before touching the flame of his torch to my greased feet. The agony I experienced was the likes of which hell is made of. I was not one of the fortunate who went unconscious from fear. In fact, I believe I was sent into a state of hyper-awareness that made me so much more sensitive to all the sensations that ran through me. I wish I could say that I had the presence of mind to pray for help, but in all truth, my brain could not have formed a coherent word, let alone a full thought. The flames raced up from my feet to my hips. It burned there for a long time, so long that I was able to watch them blacken, char, see my own bones become visible through my ruined flesh. Only when my captors deemed it appropriate did they douse my upper half in more stinking fat and push the wood close to ensure a thorough burn. At long last my brain could handle no more. I awoke in a state of panic so severe I barely remember the details. All I recall was that everything looked enormous and tall, that my back was being burned and my wrists hurt. I was easily able to slip my hands from the huge shackles and ran as hard as I could away from what burned me. I must have run for an hour before my adrenaline gave out. My whole body shut down at once, sending me sprawling to the ground. My consciousness abandoned me for the second time that day. As it turned out, I had collapsed in the field of a farming family who found me not long after I fainted. I soon realized that I had been reverted to no more than a 3-year-old child, and as such was able to go undetected by anyone who may have still been on my witch hunt. The farmers who found me were kind enough to take me in and raise me along with their other 4 children. They were in constant awe of my maturity, but believed it must have been an act of God. I was fortunate that they were too simple to question how a young child was gifted with the knowledge and skills of an adult. I eventually learned that all those present at my execution disappeared. There was no trace of the crowd, the guards, or the witch. It was quickly swept under the rug and forbidden to be spoken of. What actually happened is that the ability Mary gifted to me had activated upon my death so violently that it sucked not only the life force out of those nearby, but also absorbed their bodies as well. It was enough to fully heal me and revert me to such a young age, giving me the perfect escape and alibi. While there were search parties for a while looking for me, no one suspected a 3-year-old child of any mischief. I slowly grew up with my new family, learning the ways of a farm and what it was like to be in a family. When I initially grew up, I was an only child to a destitute whore and a housekeeper in a huge castle. No one took any true care of me. Now there was always someone to talk to, spend time with, someone to help when I needed assistance. When I was old enough, I was married to the middle son of another farmer. We had no children, despite trying hard. I've learned since that it was because I was born without a uterus of all things. I was fortunate that he was a good man. He did not have the pressure of his older brother to create an heir, thus it did not really bother him to be married to a barren wife. We lived as we pleased, and when we caught wind of a plan to cross the great sea to a new continent and establish a settlement, we were both excited at the prospect. We had grown tired of the constant turmoil caused by changing monarchs, the rampant diseases that ravaged every year, and yearned for our religious freedoms. At that time, I still held a tentative grasp to my religious convictions and was terrified to be prosecuted for it again. So, when a friend brought up to us that there was an expedition looking for volunteers to settle the new country, I was immediately ready to go. Regretfully, this was one of my most egregious mistakes. In 1584, we were abandoned by Sir Richard Greenville, our leader and captain, under the guise of going back to England to resupply. I cannot say for sure if that was his intention, but I do know that we were left to our own devices for 3 years in an unfamiliar land full of natives who were none too happy to have us. I was the only woman out of 108 people, and quickly took my place as chef and nurse while the men did their best to build us all homes, find food, try to farm this new world. We were able to build a fort, but anything we hoped to accomplish was hard won from the hostile natives that we seemed to fight endlessly with. By the time Sir Francis Drake came and offered to take us back to England, many of our number were eager to go, and they did, leaving only 50 of us who wanted to keep trying to carve out a home. We eked out a meager existence, but soon came to pass that we should have taken our chance to go home. That winter was horrid. Many fell sick, and it was my duty to tend them all. We were starving, freezing, and dying. I myself was befallen with the illness frequently, but it would take the life of another sick person already near death to heal myself to keep going. I rationalized that without me, everyone would die. By taking only what I needed to continue caring for those who could still be saved, I was doing more good than I was bad. As shameful as I found it at the time, we ate the bodies of our fallen friends. There was nothing else to eat, nothing to nourish us through that awful winter. We went so far as to grind the bones to dust and make soup with them. No remains were left of our unfortunate fallen. I'm not sure how, but the men became suspicious of my resilience to the illness plaguing us. They surmised that it must be my doing, seeing as I was healthy, and was always the last to see them alive, always the one to announce the death to the others. They banded together against me. It was their idea to kill me, make a sacrifice of me to appease God for having harbored a murderess and a possible witch in their midst. My poor, dear husband did his best to defend me, but they quickly dispatched of him. They clubbed him in the head until he stopped moving before turning their attention on me. I was furious. I had loved that silly old fool of a man, had done my best to care for these heathenish, beastly excuses of men, and this was what I was given in repayment, a bludgeoned husband and an accusation of evil. I held back nothing in absorbing them body and soul. This reverted me to just a young woman again, though this time I was more in the age of 15 years old. With a broken heart, I buried my husband as best I could. Months later, 115 more colonists led by John White arrived in search of those who had been left by Greenville. They were shocked to find me, but took my explanation of being the only survivor from a shipwreck who had found her way to this fort. I told them I did not have family back in England, and they decided to let me stay there in the settlement. I had a little living quarter of my own behind the kitchen, and was tasked with helping the older women with cooking and caring for the many people in our new colony. Many people avoided me out of trepidation, and at that point I was perfectly fine with being on my own. The repeat of events from our first colony was so eerily similar that I wondered if it were even possible to make a home out of this god-forsaken country. The natives killed us any time they caught us outside our fort walls. The stores of food the new colonists brought was quickly being depleted, and winter was coming fast. We hoped daily for the return of Captain White, who had followed in Greenville's footsteps, returning to England for supplies. We did not see him that winter, nor the next. By the winter of 1589, there was barely anyone left. Again, we had resorted to cannibalism, eating anyone who died, grinding the bones to use as soup when there was no flesh to consume. I had gone back to my method of taking the lives of anyone close to death whom I could get alone with. This time it was much more difficult. These people had family. Many slept together in piles for warmth. I was barely able to sustain myself from them as sickness spread. Eventually, our numbers dwindled down to only 20 or so weak and starving souls. I thought it a blessing one night, deep in winter, to absorb all those who remained. It was enough to cure my illness, revert me to a young girl again, and sated me until spring came. When the warm weather returned, I staged evidence in the settlement to look as though everyone had simply vanished. I carved the word Croatoan into a fence to insinuate that the colonists had moved to that nearby island. During my wait for the return of Captain White, I managed to make a decent living for myself along the coast. I became an accomplished fisher and hunter, built myself a tiny shelter, and began making preparations to live through another perilous winter. When I spotted the captain's ship anchored in the bay, I wasted no time in swimming out and stowing myself away on board. I was thoroughly sick of that new world and longed for the familiarity of home. I never imagined I would leave my beloved England again, but that was not to be. My next husband dragged me back across the ocean to the Plymouth colony once it was shown to be successful. Things at home had deteriorated to a degree that warranted the move, but I was not happy to do it. Luckily, this was a much more fruitful endeavor. We didn't face as many hardships as I did in the Roanoke settlement, for which I was eternally grateful. Over the years, I grew old, became young again, would remarry and disappear as I saw fit. Only twice did I allow myself to be turned back into a young child again to grow up. This plan worked well for me for a very long time. Not until I had a stroke in my 83-year-old current body did I discover any issues. I had been nearing death again, this time by age instead of illness, and had been planning how to go about regressing. I knew that, with how the government kept track of everyone, it would be difficult to just be a young woman without raising some sort of suspicions. I rationalized that it would be best to revert to a child, maybe 9 or 10, and let the government make me a new identity. After my stroke, I found that I was fully paralyzed. Something had happened to bury me in a waking coma. I was cognizant of the world beyond my body, but unable to interact with it. I tried to take in other lives, but it seemed not to help. I was sent to a nursing home on hospice care. The medical staff expected me to die any day, but I was not so willing. I sent my power out to collect life from the other elderly people close to death. They were the only ones weak enough for my decrepit self to drain. Anyone healthy, although the most beneficial, was simply out of my reach. This went on for a few years, but I came to the conclusion that nothing I did could snap me out of this coma. No amount of other lives could give me control back of my body. Taking years from others was only serving to prolong my own suffering in that immobile hell. All the strange, sudden deaths had garnered attention from the more curious workers, some having seen the white projection of myself as I went about my business. I heard them telling tales to each other about a ghost roaming the halls who attacked poor old people and killed them. I gave up, resigned myself to my fate, stopped taking lives, and let myself age into death. Near the end, the staff of the nursing facility saw fit to send me to the hospital to finish dying. I was made comfortable in a coma ward and left to myself. A kind nurse sat with me the night my heartbeat became irregular. I hate to admit this, but I was terrified as I began counting the beats. They were getting further and further apart. I was not yet ready to go. Maybe it was that ability that Mary had given me all those years ago that pushed me so hard to want to survive. Maybe it was just my own survival instincts. When my body finally gave out, that ability rushed out in every direction. I only knew it had done its duty when I awoke minutes later with the ability to move again. Gratefully, I sat up, eyes open for the first time in years. I had drained the lives of many other coma patients, and it had restored my movement. That was the best I had felt in many, many years. I was desperate to live again, desperate to be a young woman without a decrepit body full of pain and weakness. Unfortunately, I was not yet strong enough to take in younger lives. I had to contend myself with other elderly when I returned to the nursing home. Biding my time proved more annoying than I anticipated. While I picked my marks and gained energy, I began messing with the little housekeeper who was so suspicious of me. I knew she was nervous around me, and I felt vindictive towards her. She was young, pretty, and clearly intelligent to have caught on to me. I teased her, tried to frighten her, and generally wanted to selfishly make her suffer. I tried to take her one night. I sent my ability out to find her and did my best to kill her. I didn't want to absorb her. I didn't want her life to be responsible for sustaining me. In my dislike for her, I simply wanted her dead. She woke up as I was strangling her, and she somehow was able to throw my ghost form off of her. Enraged, I went after her little boyfriend, the CNA who was working with her to collect evidence about the haunting at the nursing home. With rage as fuel, I strangled him in his bed. I didn't even bother to take any of his energy. I knew then that I was on a time limit. The housekeeper was wise to me. She knew it had been me who tried to kill her and had succeeded in killing the boy. I would need to act quickly because of that, and also because my rejuvenation was causing a stir among staff. People were getting antsy around me. I put all my strength into a massive attack that left 5 healthy nurses dead on the floor. The face that looked back at me from the mirror as I rushed to get redressed was that of a young woman, maybe 18 or 19 at oldest. I couldn't keep the smile off my face. I quickly brushed out my hair, got dressed in a skirt, button-down shirt, and a big soft sweater. The get-up wasn't age-appropriate by any means, but it did what it needed to do. I was able to slip out of the nursing facility amid the chaos of medical staff rushing to revive the nurses and keep onlookers at bay. I chuckled to myself as I passed all that commotion. My first stop was the ATM. I withdrew all the money I could, and once I was comfortable with the cash, I began my trek to an old friend's house. Using my renewed legs felt amazing. It made me want to take the longer route to his house. This took me to the park where a trail led into the woods behind my friend's house. The excitement had clouded my senses, made me oblivious to everything around me. The mugger had shot me through the head before I even registered he had stepped out of the bushes behind me. He must have seen my enormous purse and assumed, albeit correctly, that I must have had something of value. The injury reduced me to nothing more than my ghostly form, and I was even weaker than I had been in the hospital. I don't even know what became of my physical body. It may have still been there on the pavement path, bleeding out, or just obliterated into only energy. I know that the thief got away with my bag, all my money and ID, and everything I had left. Somehow I dragged myself to the nearest shelter, which ended up being a little girl's treehouse. The little girl who owned it, Alicia, became invaluable to me in the coming weeks. She was desperate for contact, any form of friendship, and was willing to do anything to make that happen. It took nothing to convince her to bring me children to consume. She never questioned it other than just basic curiosity for why I specifically wanted them. She was cute. She was useful. I'm sorry she took the fall for my needs. I was on the verge of having enough energy to regain my human form when the police began investigating. I fled the treehouse as soon as I saw the police cars pull up in front of the house. Luckily, I was able to accost a few people on the trail, gaining just enough energy to become a person again before making it to my friend's home. Lucian, the friend, was confused when he saw me on his back porch. He was even more confused when I gave him our code. He rushed me into the house and into a spare set of clothes while grilling me on what had happened. I explained everything to him from start to end. He listened to the entire story with a look on his face that showed he believed me, but was having to reevaluate his entire belief structure. "Can you get me out of the country?" I asked. "I'm so done with this place." At that moment, I understood just how badly I wanted to go home. I missed England. I missed the farm country. I thought back all those years and felt such a yearning for that family who had taken me in, who raised me, and wished so badly that I could go back to that time and see them. They were hundreds of years in their graves, and I just wanted to go home to their little one-room cottage with its dirt floor and straw-stuffed mattresses. For a few minutes, I even considered giving away the ability that kept me alive and wither into dust like Mary had. This morbidity lasted only a little while. My survival instinct was too strong to simply give out. I stayed with Lucian while he got everything ready to get me smuggled out of the country. He set me up with a brand new British identity, complete with a visa stating I had been in the US for work-related travel. Lucian managed to get me work with a friend he had over in London in a museum when I arrived. For the last 6 months I have been in my homeland, feeling better than I have since the 1600s. I love working in the museum more than I anticipated as well. All day I help to manage the historical accuracy of a tiny village from my own time that hosts tours and a taste of the old ways. I personally oversee at least one tour per day through the small cottages, but some days I abandon my desk and do all 3 daily tours. Dressed in period-appropriate attire, I recount to my audience what life was like in the 1500s. I teach of disease, hunger, desperation, freezing, persecution, but I also relate the joy of community life, how it felt to sit with family every meal around a table full of food you grew and slaughtered yourself, not having the distractions of the modern era. I live in a small cabin on site. It's just a simple little setup with an open floor plan, very similar to the period-accurate ones, but with electricity and plumbing. This tiny cabin is the most at home I've felt in a very long time. Recently, I have also become acquainted with a funny man who visited the museum. He introduced himself as Mike, though he doesn't respond to it quite as fast as you would expect, as if it's a nickname he gave himself recently to distance himself from his former life. Mike has an American accent, no touch of the British to it at all, so I don't believe he's been here long, though he does live in the little town nearby. He's been a great companion to me. With his amiable demeanor, witty jokes, love of history, and sort of a soft appearance, I find myself drawn to him. Still, there is a cloud over him. I'm not sure what it could be, but it seems very dark, very serious. He doesn't let on much, though. I assume something must have happened to him in America, something that caused his relocation to another country. Regardless, I am comfortable with him and am happy with the way our dynamic is working out. At this point, I believe I can safely say I am happy. I'm at peace. For me, this is enough to make the suffering of my past worthwhile, and the possible suffering of my future worth getting to.